Welcome to session 6 of the Symbol course. In session 4, we discussed the first foundation of the course, its philosophical basis. Today, we continue the exploration of the foundations of the course by considering the histories of medicine and psychiatry and how emotions evolved. To watch the introductory video entitled Integral Theory Explained, please go to session 6 on the website. Next are our usual reminders, directed mostly at participants doing the course in a group. Please take a few moments to read these on your own. To watch this week's mindfulness practice video, please go to the website now. For people doing the YouTube course as part of a group, you can now pause for questions, comments, or feedback. Before we do that, and perhaps to stimulate discussion, let's take a few moments to acknowledge that by this point in the course, it's common for some concerns to have emerged. Some of us may be feeling triggered and overwhelmed by the amount of material we've covered so far, by the material we've discussed, or by the opinions of the co-leaders or other participants. These feelings could be an opportunity to practice the coping skills we're learning and to widen our window of tolerance. Coping statements are one of the distress tolerance coping skills. If you are a little overwhelmed, consider some of the following statements. All I can do is my best. Nobody understands everything. There is no test. I can't fail this course. Some people repeat the course several times and only get a few things each time. Whatever I learn might help, and it's unlikely to hurt. In between sessions, consider imagining yourself in the simple course session and using the stress tolerance strategies to try to remain in the window of tolerance. Practice this repeatedly. Almost everyone who continues in the simple course gradually starts to experience less anxiety as you progress through the course. Coping with your feelings and thoughts about the course can be important practice for coping with challenging situations in other areas of your life. Some common feelings attending the simple course may trigger are irritation, anger, anxiety, numbing, and despair. Ask yourself if these feelings and their accompanying thoughts could be dysregulated. One way to tell if they are is to ask yourself if you frequently experience similar thoughts and feelings at times other than when you're on the course. If so, these feelings may be some of your holes. If these feelings and thoughts are partly dysregulated, consider that working on them as they emerge in the course might help you to deal with similar feelings and thoughts when they emerge in other circumstances in your life. Use the skills and tools you're learning to work with this. Let's quickly review what we will do today. We'll review the simple manual session 6, which includes the histories of medicine and psychiatry, also emotions, psychodynamics, the unconscious mind, and instincts. Then we'll take a break, and we'll have time for discussion. At this point, please rate how well you think you did on your homework. Remember to use a 0 to 10 scale and to record it in your notebook. Let's briefly review what we've done so far in the course and also what we will do today. So far, in laying the foundations of the simple course, we explored some philosophical ideas, questioned the common sense view that we see the world as it is. We suggested that we see the world not as it is, but as we are. And how, if we do indeed see the world as we are, it's important to understand what we are is, because it might help to explain why each of us sees the world so differently and why we fall into our holes. We also named 3 lenses through which we see the world: our senses, cognition and thinking, and moods and feelings. We then introduced the first simple tool, crisis plans, and the distress tolerance skills you need to develop the crisis plans. Finally, we discussed one kind of crisis, suicidality, and how for those who experience it, having a crisis plan is essential. Today, in the Foundations of Simple Part 2, we'll explore the histories of medicine and psychiatry seen from an integral theory perspective. And then we'll talk about how Darwin's theory of evolution, Freud, and Jaak Panksepp contributed to our understanding of instincts, which are the physiological substrate of emotions. Today, we're focusing on the history of the understanding of the mind, psychological problems, and how to treat them. We'll also start to explore feelings. Where do they come from, and why do we have them? If we're going to talk about the histories of Western medicine and psychiatry, I wonder if it will be helpful to review some of the milestones in world history. Before we consider the histories of medicine and psychiatry, let's briefly review a timeline of Western civilization, which they are a part of. Ancient civilizations existed between 4000 and 750 BCE. The last great ice age lasted from approximately 77,000 to 12,000 BCE. Its end created a region bordering the Mediterranean, known as the Fertile Crescent, that offered the perfect conditions for agriculture and the domestication of animals, and led to the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution was the basis for the rise of some of the first ancient civilizations, which included the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Phoenicians, ancient Egyptians, and Carthaginians. Classical Greece dates from about 800 to 146 BCE. Greek city-states flourished from about 800 BCE until the Roman conquest and subjugation of Corinth in 146 BCE. Ancient Greek culture had a powerful influence on ancient Rome and is considered to be the foundation of Western culture to the present. The Roman Empire lasted from about 625 BCE to 410 CE. Powerful cities, including Rome, established themselves in Italy, starting around 900 BCE. In 509 BCE, Rome became a republic. At its peak, the Roman Empire included large territorial holdings around the Mediterranean, North Africa, and Western Asia. In 410 CE, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths, marking the end of the Roman Empire. The Middle Ages, also known as the medieval period, lasted from 476 to 1450 CE. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe was divided into small kingdoms and tribes that were frequently in conflict with each other. The Catholic Church attempted with mixed success to fill this central power vacuum. The term Dark Ages refers to the early Middle Ages, from the 5th to the 10th centuries, immediately after the fall of Rome, that was marked by economic, intellectual, and cultural decline. The modern era refers to the period from the end of the Middle Ages to the present. The early modern era spans from 1450 to 1750 CE, while the modern era per se is considered to have started in 1750 and continues to the present. The modern era saw a number of major historical movements and events. First, the Renaissance, or rebirth, from 1400 to 1500, so-called because classical Greek culture, which had been preserved by the Muslims and Irish, was rediscovered. Two, the Protestant Reformation, from 1517 to 1648. The Catholic Church began to lose its monopoly on culture and power around the time that Martin Luther made public his 95 Theses, in which he criticized the Catholic Church for corruption and, among other things, the selling of indulgences. The Reformation was catalyzed by the invention in 1440 by Johannes Gutenberg of the printing press. Three, the Scientific Revolution, from 1543 to 1687. It was launched by Copernicus with the publication of the heliocentric cosmological model and culminated in 1687 with Newton's publication of the Principia. The Enlightenment, from 1650 to 1800, an intellectual movement also known as the Age of Reason, which placed value on human happiness, the pursuit of knowledge through reason, and ideals such as liberty, progress, toleration, fraternity, and the separation of church from state. These ideals were embodied in the French Revolution of 1848 and the American Declaration of Independence of 1776, as well as the American Constitution of 1787. The Enlightenment has also been called the rediscovery of ignorance because it revived the epistemic humility of Socrates, who said, I know nothing. The Enlightenment gave rise to liberalism. The Industrial Revolution from 1760 to 1840 began in England, but became a global phenomenon. It consisted of a series of events that transformed manufacturing processes and saw massive migration of people to the cities. After the Agricultural Revolution, it was the most transformative event in world economic history. The history of Western civilization can be understood from the perspective of integral theory. Integral theory postulates that one of the lenses through which we see the world is that of the stages of growth or development that we're at. The stage of growth or development we are at determines human culture, institutions, and how we see the world, relate to it, and to each other. The integral stages of development, or ways of seeing the world, have evolved in the 200,000 years since humans became a distinct species. They are from the most ancient to the most recent. One, archaic, 200,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens, before our migration out of Africa, were at this stage of development. Everyone was struggling for their own survival and banded together with others in small family groups. Two, tribal and warrior. Starting about 50,000 years ago, human social groups increased in complexity as small tribes consisting of several families started to cooperate under the leadership of a strong individual. Three, traditional. Starting about 5,000 years ago, cooperation began among the members of a much larger group or nation who may never have met in person, who follow commonly accepted values, rules, roles, and discipline, typically enforced by a few individuals, typically monarchs and clergy. This stage saw the introduction of laws and written records. The modern stage. Starting about 500 years ago, cooperation began among the same or larger number of individuals as in traditional societies. But personal autonomy and initiative became critical, and the emphasis on the collective began to be balanced with the rights of the ordinary individual. Postmodern started about 80 years ago. Pluralism, equality, and sensitivity became highly valued. The rights of non-dominant or minority groups began to be protected from the majority's social norms, values, rules, and roles, which began to be seen as oppressive of those minority groups. Six, integral, which started about 30 years ago. The perspectives of all the stages of development began to be seen as making important contributions to society. A multi-perspectival view became valued. All stages began to be recognized as having dark sides, especially when they think they are the only stage that has the truth. Health professionals and patients also see health and illness differently, depending on the stage of development they are at. An integral perspective helps us see the histories of medicine and psychiatry from the perspective of the stages of growth. After that whirlwind overview of world history, can you zoom in on the histories of medicine and psychiatry and tell us why it's important to discuss these in the simple course? Following integral theory's description of the stages of cultural growth, let's start with the archaic, tribal, and warrior stages view of medicine and mental health. Our ancient ancestors had much shorter lifespans than we do today, 30 to 40 years in prehistoric times, but significant child mortality brought that average lifespan to much lower than that. The most common medical issues that affected them were also different from the ones that affect us today. They included arthritis and back issues because of heavy labor and frequent injuries, infections because of cuts, other injuries, and poor hygiene, nutritional deficiencies such as rickets, scurvy, and starvation, problems from environmental exposure, physical injuries, and birth complications. The most common ancient medical treatments included ingestion or local application of plant products or earth and clays. Surgery, such as setting of bones and trepanation. While some health issues were clearly the result of injuries, many others were thought to be the result of spells, the will of a supernatural force, or possession by spirits. Shaman and medicine men provided medical care. Much of this care consisted of rituals meant to break spells, appease the supernatural forces, or exorcise spirits. Following the archaic, tribal, and warrior stages is the traditional stage. The traditional stage of medicine and psychiatry began in ancient Greece. Hippocrates and Galen made popular the humoral theory that medical problems were a result of a lack of balance between the four fluids that made up the body: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. These imbalances were treated with practice such as bleeding, emetics, purges, or plant products. Rather than resorting to doctors, most people sought care from the clergy and from lay healers. The church had very specific protocols for dealing with issues such as spiritual possession through exorcism. At the traditional stage of development, members of a society who did not follow established norms, values, rules, and roles were either considered to be bad or under the influence of evil forces. Traditional perspectives persist today among some segment of the population. If people were judged to be under the influence of an evil force, it was often thought that it was because they were being punished for some sin. The treatments for the malevolent force to be exorcised or in some way made to leave the afflicted person. If people were instead judged to be bad, they had to be controlled and punished until they reformed and repented. In either case, the goal was conformity of the individual behavior to the established norms, values, rules, and roles of the group. There were significant inequities in how people were treated, with the well-off more often being handled with rituals such as exorcisms, whereas the poor were more likely to be imprisoned or burned at the stake. The traditional stage is followed by the modern stage. When did the modern stage of medicine and psychiatry begin, and what did it look like? Psychiatry arose as a distinct field in the recent modern era. In the 18th century, traditional treatments for mental disorders began to be scientifically tested. In one such early experiment, possessed people were given consecrated water, which had been found to have healing properties. If, however, people were given consecrated water and told it was regular water, they didn't improve. People given ordinary water and told it was consecrated did improve. In the 18th century, influenced by Newtonian scientific discoveries of this time, Franz Mesmer speculated that many mental illnesses were caused by a disruption of people's magnetism, which he claimed to be able to heal because of his own natural animal magnetic powers. Although Mesmer had good results with his technique, his theory was eventually discredited. He was succeeded by hypnotists who had equally good success with their approach. Modern medicine and psychiatry take a philosophical materialist perspective and are primarily biological and disease-oriented. They value rationality and the scientific method and reject pre-traditional, traditional, and integral perspectives. Modern medicine assumes that if a person is ill, there must be a disease or something wrong with their body or brain. Since the brain is considered, in the materialist perspective, to be the organ from which mind arises, if there is something wrong with a person's mind, as manifested in their thinking, feelings, or behavior, it must be because there's something physically wrong with their brain. The brain can be studied through imaging and altered with chemicals, magnetic currents, or electricity. Modern psychiatry believes that the way to treat dysregulated thoughts, feelings, and behaviors is with physical interventions, such as medication, ECT, transcranial magnetic stimulation, etc. Over the last 200 years, modern biological and psychiatric medicine has made enormous contributions to human health and well-being. Modern psychiatry has also made some huge mistakes. Medicine progressed greatly from adopting the scientific method, which led to the medical model of disease. Major milestones in modern medicine include 1799, smallpox vaccine and inoculation, 1846, anesthesia, 1861, the germ theory of disease, 1886, appendicitis, 1922, Banting and Best discovered insulin and won a Nobel Prize. 1928, penicillin was discovered. 1954 saw the introduction of the first organ transplants and oral contraceptives. Psychiatry also adopted the medical or biological model of disease, but 100 years after medicine. Some of the milestones in modern psychiatry were not as illustrious as those in modern medicine. In 1927, Sackel uses insulin shock therapy. In the same year, Wagner Juarez discovers malarial therapy for tertiary syphilis. In 1938, Serletti and Binney introduced electroconvulsive therapy based on their observations in depressed epileptics and also the unpredictability of chemical seizure agents. In 1944, amphetamines were used by German troops in World War II. In 1948 to 1970, lithium was studied and introduced as a psychiatric medication. In 1949, Eggers Muniz wins the Nobel Prize for inventing lobotomy, and Walter Friedman does thousands of them in the US. In 1952, chlorpromazine, the first antipsychotic, was discovered. Heinz Lehmann brought it to North America. The same year, the DSM was first published, and hyperniazid, a tuberculosis drug, was found to have antidepressant properties. In 1957, tricyclic antidepressants were introduced, and in 1960, benzodiazepines were introduced. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association declassified homosexuality as a mental disorder. In 1988, Prozac was introduced. What about the postmodern stage of medicine and psychiatry? One of the earliest proponents of a psychiatry that embodied postmodern values was Philip Pinel, 1745 to 1826. Pinel lived through the French Revolution of 1799. He is most famous for having reformed psychiatric asylums and liberated inmates from their appalling conditions, including being confined and in chains. Postmodernity values sensitivity and equality and rejects many of the views of traditionalism and modernity. It believes that people are made sick by others, society, and institutions. It considers that some medical procedures and medications can be means of controlling or suppressing individuality. There is a stream within postmodernity that is anti-psychiatry, seeing it as illegitimate means of controlling oppressed groups. One of the most radical postmodern anti-psychiatry voices was psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, who wrote the 1961 classic, The Myth of Mental Illness. The postmodern anti-psychiatry movement is alive and well today and has made very important contributions to the dialogue around mental health. What about the integral stage of medicine and psychiatry? Integral psychiatry, the perspective that Simple takes, considers biological, psychological, social, and spiritual perspectives to be equally important in understanding of the mind. Maurice Bucke, born in 1837 and died in 1902, was a pioneer of the biopsychosocial-spiritual and integral approach to psychiatry. As a young man, Bucke was an adventurer. While prospecting for gold, he had a hostile encounter with a group of Native North Americans, nearly died, and had a life-changing mystical near-death experience. He then attended McGill University's medical school. After graduating, he took a job as a ship's surgeon and later became superintendent of the London Asylum for the Insane, where he remained from 1877 to 1902. The London Asylum for the Insane became Regional Mental Health Care London. Buck promoted the humane care of patients, introducing sports and occupational therapy in their treatment. He became friends with Walt Whitman, who wrote Leaves of Grass, whom he had met in 1880 when he gave a talk at the American Psychiatric Conference in Philadelphia. He invited Whitman, who had a mentally ill brother, to London to advise him on the care of the asylum's patients. Buck wrote Cosmic Consciousness, a study on the evolution of the human mind. In it, he describes his mystical experience and how it transformed his views of reality. You watch two videos, one on the history of psychiatry and the other on the history of psychiatric treatments. Please go to the website now. Each of the stages of growth has a different perspective and approach to mental health. Which perspective is dominant in the present day? The term cultural wars refers to the intense conflicts arising between groups within a community, country, or society that have conflicting sets of views and beliefs about the world. Beyond mere disagreements, these are wars because each of these groups holds their particular belief to be existential or right, good, and necessary for the preservation and survival of their society, and holds that the beliefs of the other groups are wrong, evil, and will lead to the destruction of that society. From an integral perspective, these groups disagree because they see the world through the lenses of different stages of development and the warrior, traditional, modern, and postmodern stages. Since emotional mind is contagious, these groups trigger one another. This is amplified by social media. In mental health, the cultures that have been in conflict for the last 100 years are the currently dominant modern biological psychiatry and the various postmodern and integral biopsychosocial spiritual approaches. Simple takes an integral biopsychosocial spiritual approach in its attempt to understand mental health issues. The main psychological theory we explore in this course is called psychodynamics. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung were the co-founders of this approach. Modern biological psychiatry assumes healthy human beings are rational. If that's the case, then when human beings are not rational, according to biological psychiatry, it must be because of a brain abnormality that is causing the irrationality or mental disorder. Dynamics means the forces or properties that stimulate growth, development, or change within a system. Dynamic psychiatry studies the forces and processes that explain how the mind works. Psychodynamics is the systematic study of the psychological forces that underlie human behavior, feelings, and thoughts, and how they relate to the individual's life experiences. Dynamic psychiatry offers models or theories of the mind that explain why people are sometimes irrational without postulating a brain abnormality. Instead, it postulates psychological explanations for the seemingly irrationality. In this course, we will explore these models. This exploration will start with Sigmund Freud, who pioneered the study of the dynamics of mind. Understanding the history of medicine and psychiatry is one of the foundations of the simple course. The other we're covering today is understanding how emotions evolved. Where do we start? One good place to start is by exploring what emotions are. Emotions are a natural instinctive state of mind deriving from one's circumstances, mood, or relationships with others. They're an instinctive or intuitive feeling as distinguished from reasoning or knowledge. Instincts are the biological evolutionary brain systems which underpin emotions. Charles Darwin, who lived from 1839 to 1882, described 6 core emotions: anger, fear, surprise, disgust, happiness, and sadness. Psychologist Paul Ekman studied 18 different world cultures and concluded that the core emotions described by Darwin are universal. Emotions are not just facial expressions. They express themselves in the whole body. Core emotions lead either to approach or retreat behaviors, draw us towards or away from something. Emotions can be mapped to the body. Body sensations associated with different emotions are very specific and contribute significantly to the conscious feeling of emotion. The slide on the bottom left shows a scan in which warm colors represent heightened sensations, cold colors decrease sensations. Somatic psychotherapy, such as somatic experiencing, emphasize observing body sensations. This is a form of mindfulness that can be helpful in reducing automatic acting out of emotions and enhance emotional regulation. Emotions consist of one, the internal experience we call feelings, as well as two, an outer physical and behavioral expression called affect. Feelings can manifest as affect or can be contained and hidden. We normally think of feelings as being primary and their physical expression or affect as being secondary. But expressing the affect or behavior associated with one of the core emotions can, even in the absence of that feeling, generate it. With those definitions in mind, let's talk about the great pioneer in the understanding of emotions, Sigmund Freud. Freud's life work was to understand emotions and their role in psychological illnesses. Psychodynamics, the field he founded, provides us with useful models of how the mind works. Sigmund Freud lived from 1856 to 1939. His psychodynamic theory is key to understanding of emotions. We'll explore in some detail in this course. Personality is defined as a person's typical patterns of thought, emotional reactions, and behavior. Therefore, to understand personality, we must understand both emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. As we will explore later in the course, there are several different personality theories. In simple, we will focus on one of those theories, psychodynamics, which was first proposed by Sigmund Freud. Freud postulated a theory of mind in which both conscious and unconscious forces determine personality. Freud had theories of how the mind is organized and how it develops. These are known respectively as the structural and developmental theories. Today, we'll consider Freud's structural theory, which is well supported by current-day neuroscience and describes the relationship between thinking and emotions. In future sessions, we'll consider his developmental theory. What can you tell us about how Freud's ideas evolved? Today, the most commonly made mental health diagnoses are depression and anxiety. A good place to start trying to understand Freud's ideas is to consider the most common diagnosis that was made in Freud's day, hysteria. The word hysteria comes from the Greek hysterikos, meaning suffering in the womb. The ancient Greeks believed that when a woman was being irrational, it was because her uterus was literally wandering around her body, causing trouble. That remained the prevalent explanation for emotional dysregulation in women until the 19th century. Today, the word hysteria has negative connotations and is considered demeaning to women. The people who were diagnosed with it in the 19th century are today labeled as having psychosomatic illnesses, conversion disorders, traumatic spectrum disorders, and personality disorders. Discoveries in neurology in the 19th century led to the rise of modern psychiatry. One of these was the mapping of dermatomes and the realization that phenomena such as glove anesthesia were functional, not organic. An organic condition is a disease for which a biological explanation has been found. A functional condition is an illness for which a biological explanation has yet to be found. Absent a biological explanation for hysteria, neurologists in the 19th century, including Charcot, Janet, and Freud, began to postulate psychological explanations for it. Freud spent 5 months in Paris in 1885 studying with the famous neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital. When he returned to Vienna to start his medical practice, he became friends with Joseph Breuer, another neurologist interested in hysteria. Breuer was at the time treating a patient who is famously known as Anna O. Her real name was Bertha Pappenheim. She was born in 1859 and died in 1936. While caring for her dying father, Anna O developed several typical hysterical symptoms: partial paralysis, blurred vision, headaches, and hallucinations. In treatment with Breuer, she disclosed a traumatic experience of a sexual nature. Her case features in the 1895 book Studies in Hysteria, co-written by Breuer and Freud. Pappenheim went on to be a pioneer in the field of social work. When Freud went to Paris to study with Charcot, hypnosis was the most common treatment for psychological disorders. When Freud returned to Vienna and started treating patients, he had difficulty inducing hypnotic trances and experimented with variations of technique until he found a practice that suited him, in which he instructed people to say whatever came into their minds without censoring it. As his patients engaged in this free association or talking cure, they frequently reveal traumatic memories that they previously seemed unaware of. Freud began to think that while some memories were conscious, others, especially traumatic ones, were unconscious, because to protect itself, the mind repressed them. Freud thought that free association gave patients access to their unconscious memories, and that when people became conscious or aware of their previously unconscious conflicts, their symptoms improved and resolved. From these observations emerged Freud's structural theory. Freud had a theory about how the human mind was structured. Can you tell us more about that? Freud postulated that there were three different levels of awareness in the mind: the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious levels. He also thought that the mind was composed of three interacting structures: the id, superego, and ego. The id is mostly unconscious and consists of our animal instincts. It's our emotional mind. It follows the pleasure principle or eros. In a car metaphor, it's the accelerator. The superego is both conscious and unconscious. It is the seat of the social norms, directions, and interdictions we learn as we grow up. It is rational mind. It is the brakes. The ego negotiates, mediates, and tries to find a balance between the id and the superego. It is the driver of the personality. It is the balance between rational and emotional minds. The conflicts between id and superego, if not well mediated by the ego, generate psychological symptoms. People with so-called ego strength manage conflicts better and balance rational and emotional mind. From this perspective, the strategy discussed in simple can be thought of as ego strengthening. Freud wasn't the only one developing theories about the mind. Freud considered Carl Jung his most gifted student and his chosen successor until the two had a falling out in 1913. One of the main reasons for this falling out was that while Freud was an atheist and considered religious the unconscious mind's need for wish fulfillment, Jung was deeply spiritual and during his life had multiple mystical experiences, which informed his understanding of the mind. Jung's psychology is also known as depth psychology. Rather than seeing the mind as a metaphoric iceberg like Freud did, Jung saw it as an archipelago in which what at the surface appears to be an unconnected series of islands is in fact in the ocean depths, part of the same tectonic plate. Like Freud, Jung's theory postulates the unconscious, subconscious, and personal unconscious. But in addition, he also names the collective unconscious, which is the deep unconscious part of mind, where all of our individual and seemingly separate consciousness are in fact one. To watch a video on history's verdict on Freud's work, please go to the website. Instincts, it seems, are the key to understanding emotions. Can you tell us more about instincts? The heart has reasons that reason does not know. Blaise Pascal. Key to understanding emotions is understanding instincts, which are associated with brain systems and are the physiological substrate of emotions. Instincts are innate fixed patterns of behaviors that are response to stimuli. They serve to maintain the homeostasis, which is equilibrium of physiological processes, which is necessary for survival. Instincts are evolutionarily ancient. Instincts are considered to be a part of the Freudian id and the unconscious. They are one of the lenses through which we see the world. The intensity of each instinct is at birth different in each person. Life experience, such as our early relationships with our caretakers or traumatic events we may live through, also strengthen or weaken instincts. In Simple, we will discuss at length how a person's dysregulated emotions arise from instincts and how therapy approaches this. Today, we'll take a journey back in time to look at how and why instincts arose and evolved from the beginning of life on Earth about 3.7 billion years ago. In 2 weeks, we will discuss a parallel, much more recent, fragile, conscious survival strategy, cognition and thinking, and how and why they evolved. Freud thought that the id was part of the unconscious. But what is the unconscious? Freud's id is comprised of instincts. Freud popularized the term instinct. He postulated that there were two instincts that were part of the id: eros, or the life instinct, and thanatos, or the death instinct. By eros, he meant not just sex instinct, as is often misrepresented, but also our intense drive to survive. Freud's thanatos, or death instinct, is the human tendency for aggression towards the self and others. It includes human destructive, risky, and otherwise negative behavior. Over the last 100 years, our ideas about instincts have changed owing to our understanding of evolution. Our understanding of instincts stems from Darwin's theory of evolution of the species. Darwin's work was made possible by the finding of geologists, including his friend Charles Lyell, who, based on fossil findings, developed the concept of deep time, which postulates that the Earth was billions of years old. The discovery that the Earth was so old was necessary for Darwin's theory of evolution through random mutations and natural selection, a mechanism which would not be possible in a shorter time span. Instincts have been evolving from the beginning of life on Earth. What if we condensed 4.5 billion years of Earth's history into 1 year? The universe is 13.7 billion years old. Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Imagine that the whole history of life on Earth spans just 1 year instead of 4.5 billion years. From January 1st until October, there were only bacteria. In November, life as we know it first appeared in the Cambrian explosion. Humans arose on December 31st at approximately 11 p.m. and spent an hour roaming around as hunter-gatherers. We invented farming at 11:58 p.m. Everything we call history happened in the 60 seconds before midnight. To watch a video on human evolution, please go to the website now. Has our understanding of evolution changed since Freud's time? We owe much of our current understanding of instincts to Estonian-American neuroscientist Jaak Panček, who defined them as brain systems that promote survival. Panček helped us understand how instincts evolved. The Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago. Life first arose on the sea, 3.7, and on land 3.2 billion years ago. The Precambrian era spans from 3.7 billion years to 450 million years ago, when a sudden increase in the variety and complexity of life occurred, likely due to an increase in the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. During the Precambrian era, there were only unicellular and simple multicellular life forms, which were obliviously unaware of each other and got their energy from the sun or from organic molecules in the chemical soup in which they lived. These organisms had developed three instincts: seeking good conditions for survival, such as heat, nutrition, right composition of the surroundings, and avoidance of bad conditions for survival. Both seeking and avoidance present from the beginning of life on Earth. The earliest form of lust, or seeking sexual reproduction, occurred 2 billion years ago in the prokaryotic exchange of genetic material. The Cambrian explosion refers to a period of time, 540 million years ago, that lasted 20 million years. during which the diversity of life suddenly exploded and organisms became much more complex. The precursors of the central nervous system, called neural nets, appeared in jellyfish around this time. Neural nets are spread across the body and coordinate sensation and action in multicellular organisms. Other coordination in these organisms occurs via the precursor of the endocrine system. Endocrine systems began as cells in multicellular organisms communicated and coordinated their activities via chemical messengers that are still used today: serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, glutamate, and GABA. The Cambrian explosion was a biological arms race which saw for the first time organisms preying on one another as sources of energy. This preying and fleeing predators gave rise to the fight or flight instinct. As organisms become more complex, they were born immature and needed a period of parental caregiving in order to survive. This gave rise to attachment and loss, or attachment/grief. As organisms became even more complex, so did their behaviors. Becoming proficient at complex behaviors such as social interactions and hunting requires practice. This is the role of play, which is the most recently evolved of the instincts. How are Freud's and Panchak's instincts related? Freud named two instincts, Panchak 6. They do, however, overlap. Freud's eros, or life instinct, is the same as Panchak's seeking, lust, attachment, and play. Freud's thanatos, or death instinct, is the same as Panchak's fight or flight, loss, panic, and grief. There have been many other contributors to our current understanding of instincts, including the father of attachment theory, John Bowlby. Later in the course, we will consider in great detail how insecure, in contrast to secure attachment, can explain a great number of psychiatric problems. We will also look at how trauma dysregulates the fight, flight, and seeking systems, and how this too explains many psychiatric issues. On the PowerPoint presentation that you will find on the website, there is a review and practice component that covers the tools, techniques, and strategies that we have previously discussed in the simple course. Looking over those slides will help you consolidate the material. Let's look at the homework for this session. Continue tracking and practicing the skills you are learning. Use the DBT diary card. Submit questions or comments to itssimple2023@gmail.com. Read the skills training workbook, pages 33 to 46. Read the simple manual, session 7. Create your distraction plan. That is your interim favorite items from the menu. Create a relaxation plan. Remember, these can be incorporated into your crisis plan. Continue working on your crisis plans. Memorize them and practice them in your imagination. Use your distraction or relaxation plan to complete your crisis plan. Thank you for spending this time with me, and see you next session.